From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joel Mitchell. How today, Joel?
I'm okay, but more importantly, you just played tennis in the rain at lunchtime. How are you?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, it was raining and it's December.
Yeah.
And it was like a cold rain as well. It's like a winter rain.
Not a tropical rain.
Yeah, very weird for Perth. One of the signs of the apocalypse, no doubt. Yeah, surprisingly, I did actually middle a number of balls. Hey. Yeah, unsurprisingly, I also missed balls completely and hit the frame a few times. But no, I was good. The big test for me was my knee. I've had a dodgy knee for a while and it held up despite the conditions. So
right, well done.
Yes, no, I felt it was I definitely felt accomplishment from that.
Yeah, I heard the court was a bit slippery as well. So.
It's very slippery. There's like algae on it. So it's very dangerous. So I don't know if our workers' compensation insurance extends to lunchtime activities on algae covered ground, but
probably not. Good.
Well, I don't have to pay out.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about that offline.
Yeah, we'll get Dan to look into that
one.
Dan
will, yeah.
Yeah. Nice one. Hey, you know what? The weather, I feel, is actually probably what the Northern Hemisphere are pretty close to what they're experiencing at the moment, minus the snow.
We're like 20 degrees. I think they'd be like...
Freezing,
please.
Well, for this time of year. But we got someone from the Northern Hemisphere.
We do.
So we should introduce her in.
Yes.
Okay, so based in Switzerland, she is a registered psychologist and worked for the United Nations International Labour Organization. And she's also an active member of the World Health Organization's Pan-European Working Group on Workplace Mental Health. She is the CEO and founder of Inner Work. Welcome to the podcast, Susanna Harkonen.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you on, Susanna. I've been, we've been talking to for at least the past year or so. So, great to finally get you on the podcast and talk about your work.
Mm. Yeah, it's great to be here. Your podcast is actually the one podcast I listen to regularly.
It's the only one you need to listen to.
Yeah. You get everything, education, entertainment. What more do you want?
I don't know. There's no vampire slayers. We can work on that one. Yeah.
I actually listen to your podcast for information, but also for therapeutic purposes, because this is a lonely space sometimes. And yours is the one which resonates mostly with me in this space.
There you go. Come for the company.
Yeah. And the excellent network.
Yeah, that's it.
What other podcasts do you like to listen to, Susanna?
Apart from yours, maybe a couple of Spanish podcasts, like Radio Ambulante and Defensa Propia.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those ones. Yeah.
Those, familiar.
Yeah, I like those. Yeah. See.
Excellent. Smooth.
Very good.
All right. Look, I'm really interested to hear this next question. Tell us, please, about your professional career, because the ILO was always like when I grow up and become a real grown-up, that's where I want to work. So I'm really keen to hear about that.
Okay, the ILO, I didn't go to the ILO directly. I actually have a background in supply chain management, logistics and supply chain management. So I did that for a number of years. And then I ended up in China as a managing director or general manager of a company there. And those were the crazy years in China when anything went. And that's how I got into health, psychological health and well-being, because my own health was taking a toll in those tough times. So what happened? I ended up actually there's a connection with Australia, which is kind of funny. Australians have always been part of my psychosocial health and well-being, because there were lots of Aussies, of course, in Australia, and I ran into a wonderful counselor at the time called Joanne. So hi, Joanne, if you're out there. And then she inspired me so much that I actually got I volunteered for Lifeline. And then from Lifeline, I actually got a counseling degree. And once when I had my counseling degree, I thought that I'm going to save the world and the world of work. And I went and worked for the International Labour Organization, which is, of course, the governing body in the world of work. And it wasn't exactly what I had thought, but it was very interesting.
And where did you go from there? How did you end up where you are now?
Well, then I worked for the ILO for a couple of years, and I worked with the big brands. We were improving workplace well-being and working conditions for the really, really big brands in the world, the Walmarts of this world, the Fortune 500, and a couple of like the really big ones. And when I realized that it wasn't exactly what I had thought. It was very interesting, like I said, but the well-being aspect wasn't really part of it. But we worked a lot with the occupational safety and health. That was one of the key areas that we worked on. So it was probably 70% of all the issues in companies are related to occupational safety and health. So that was a very interesting part of my career, and I was exposed to these things all over the world. So the program that I worked on 5 continents. So I got to see things in Africa, I got to see things in Asia, Central America, and so on and so forth. So it was really, really an eye opener. And then I live in Switzerland, where motherhood and work don't really go very well hand in hand. So I had to make a career choice and take a step back and actually be more present for my daughter. And that's how I ended up doing what I do.
So a lot of your work with the ILO originally was in supply chain management. Is that right?
It was a global working conditions.
Yeah. And so that was broad, I guess, in terms of working conditions, not just psych health and safety related, which is obviously the topic of our show.
No, and in those days, occupational safety and health is more like working condition, wages, working hours, and things like that. So psych health and safety wasn't even part of the conversation, really. Of course, there are conversations about how people can have a better dialogue in the workplace, employers and employees, that sort of things. But it wasn't really on the table at the time.
Yeah. So these days, your work though is a lot more focused around psych health and safety. So how did that come to eventuate?
Well, because I am trained in occupational safety and health, as it's called at the ILO. It's safety and health, not health and safety. It doesn't matter, but this is the way they call it. That's why it's OSH. I ended up doing that work because I was always interested in psychological well-being, and I have a background. In my first job, I was, I had a near burnout, and not due to, I was working very hard. But it was also a values clash, and it was a whole host of other things. And ever since my first job, I've been interested in psychological well-being at work. Of course, as a counselor, I already had my counseling degree. Of course, this is something that I wanted to promote. So it became it was a very natural evolution. And then the clients that I got were all struggling with workplace issues. So I didn't get counseling clients that would be there for couple issues or anything else. It was always work related. So I've heard a lot.
Yeah, that's a fairly common narrative that we hear from people who move from that counselling or clinical space into the preventative sort of space in organisations. That pattern of, well, I keep seeing that work's the problem. I'm going to go and try to fix that instead of patching people up after the damage is already done.
Sounds a little bit similar to our colleague, Dr. Alicia Pappas's
sure does
origin story,
among others.
Yeah, and it's really rewarding because then you can have a bigger impact. Because I've always worked with bigger organizations. So the ILO is a huge organization, and I've worked with the large multinationals, and there you can make a real impact instead of working one-on-one.
Yeah. So can you tell us a bit more about that, like what you did working for the ILO, and maybe starting out with what what the ILO's role actually is in the world of work for listeners who aren't aware.
Yeah, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is actually the oldest organization at the United Nations. It was founded in 1919, and with the big dream of having an 8-hour work week. I always find it so inspirational, this part, because they were considered as total utopians at the time, and that always inspires me when I think of the ILO, because we are now at the threshold of doing something very similar with psychological health and safety at work. So there's a real shift, and there needs to be a real awareness building, and this is what they did in those days. So they were real pioneers. And the ILO is a tripartite organization, which means that you have the employees, employers, and the governments coming together and deciding on issues related to the world of work. It's the governing body in the world in this space, and as you can imagine, it's not easy to make all of these decisions always, because they have conflicting interest. When you are an employer, you want other things than the employee wants, and governments have their issues, and so on and so forth. So it takes a lot of time. The decision-making process isn't straightforward or easy. And for example, the decision making often takes years to, they take years to prepare for any important decision.
Mm. And so you mentioned a little bit of the work that you were doing with them. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, we were working, it's a program called Better Work, and we were improving working conditions for the large retailers and companies around the world. So making sure that there was more social dialogue between the managers and the workers. For example, that we were doing also audits on what's really going on. And when I mentioned the occupational safety and health was actually roughly, I think it was more than 70% of the issues that we discovered were always related to occupational safety and health. And we didn't even look at the psychological side of things, so we probably would have found even more if that had been the case. But the idea was to promote a more systematic approach, and then improve those conditions, and then measure what was being done and whether there was any improvement. And my role was pretty much on training and capacity building around the world. So training anybody from factory worker to a minister.
So that's a lot of variability, I imagine, looking across different countries and regions, different levels of maturity within organisations and sort of governments and legislative environments and all of that sort of thing. How do you approach that?
It is a fantastic way to see how these things function, because there are many moving parts and they are brushing against each other. So there's this constant advocacy that needs to go on. And there's a constant pushback from some stakeholder groups, or, just getting people to come together to the same table is already a challenge. And then making things move is another. What is interesting, though, when you work with companies and international organizations, is that companies come in with money, and they come in with that power to make change happen. So you can push it from the government side, which is helpful. For example, in Australia, things have happened since, legislation has been changing. It's very helpful, and it's even needed. But then when you get that money and that pressure that you can bring from corporations, then you can actually start seeing real traction, and those two together make a change.
But I can see why the making sure that the tripartite function remains and that the employee voice is heard it is really critical there, because with the power clearly sits with the employee who has the money, and the government who has the legislative power. So ensuring that the employee voice is included in that process would also be a difficult process, I'm sure.
Yeah, it is, but the trade union is actually pretty good at that. And And they've been doing a lot of good things in terms of psychological health and safety. They've really been driving the agenda. It's not the employers at the moment, it's more the employees' representatives around the world.
Mm.
Now, Susanna, a few months back, it was actually around mid-year, you were really excited and you messaged me about some updates to the fundamental rights at work that the ILO are responsible for. So occupational health and safety became the 5th fundamental right at work in June. So can you tell us a little bit more about the process of or what are the fundamental rights at work and the process of adding occupational health and safety to that?
Yeah, this is really exciting in so many ways because it's a real shift, and it just shows that this has become a really, really important topic. So the 5 fundamental rights at work, or the core labor, what they also called labor rights, is child labor, prevention of child labor, prevention of discrimination, prevention of forced labor, then freedom of association and collective bargaining, meaning that you can join a union, you can form a union, and then occupational safety and health is now the 5th one. And people often don't realize that this wasn't part of a fundamental right at work. We obviously many of us assume that it's part of them. It was a very big surprise for me when I joined the ILO and said, this is not part of core labor rights, like you can you're safe at work. But now it is. And this means that governments, employers, and employees recognize that it's really a very, very important thing. And why I'm so excited about it is because now it's not possible to ignore it anymore. You don't want to have child labor in your supply chains. You don't want to have forced labor in your supply chains. And you also want to have proper occupational safety and health in your supply chains or in your company. So it just puts an additional pressure on governments to improve legislation, like it's happening around the world at the moment. But it also puts pressure on the companies to do something about it. And this is just fantastic. Because unfortunately, unless there is legislative pressure, companies often don't. Volunteer initiatives may include a few companies, but it doesn't include the majority of them. I don't know about your experience in Australia around this, but this has been my experience.
Yeah, well, we have pretty strong legislation in Australia around workplace health and safety. And yeah, we have regulators, obviously, that regulate. But you look at places like Southeast Asia and the Middle East, and, recently, obviously, topical is Qatar and the construction efforts that went on behind FIFA and the number of migrant workers who died, at work. It's horrible, because it isn't a fundamental right in a lot of countries. So what sort of changes do you see this elevation by the ILO with this being occupational health and safety now being a fundamental labour right? Do you see improvements in places like Southeast Asia and in the Middle East where they rely so heavily on migrant workers for jobs that aren't safe?
What I'm seeing is more conversations around the topic. I'm not seeing a change yet as such, but I'm seeing more conversations around this topic. And as I said earlier, these things take time. Legislative changes take time. There's lots of moving parts. So, but the most important piece is that we're talking about it and we're talking about it globally. And it has become something where the pressure is on governments as well to do something about it. So maybe, I would say maybe 2 to 3 years from now, we'll see a very different world. I'd like to see a very different world. Let's say 5 years from now, that this becomes a more common practice. But of course, I'm a very realistic person. I don't expect miracles, but I also think that we need to have an ideal in mind. We need to be inspired by something. If you look at the ILO, for example, with this illusion of having 8-hour work week, I mean, come on, it's a huge thing. In those days, people were really being ridiculed for having such a such an idea. Nowadays, it's normal. So I'm really hoping that psychological and occupational safety and health will become very normal.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate, like Joelle and myself, to be living in Australia where, there is such a strong culture and employer responsibility for health and safety. It'd be good to see some of those other less developed countries catch up a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we still have supply chain issues in Australia though, where work is outsourced to those countries where those rigorous laws around occupational health and safety don't apply. And I guess, organisations in Australia cover that more through their ESG approach with supply chain management. But, yeah, I think that, absolutely, the more that those standards internationally can be improved, then the less opportunity there is for companies in places like Australia to take advantage of countries where those laws aren't in place.
Yeah, I mean, you look at things now like child labour and that sort of thing, like a big brand, there's no way that they would be definitely getting down in the supply chain and making sure there's no child labour being exploited as part of that, right? So if we can see the same sort of drive around occupational health and safety, and Lendlease is a great example, Crystal sharing with us the example of, using migrant workers in, was it in Malaysia or, one of those Southeast Asian countries, and that these migrant workers work 90-hour weeks, but Lendlease would only employ them for 60 hours. And so in order to prevent these migrant workers going out and getting a second job because 60 hours wasn't enough, they would actually pay them for 90 because health and safety was so important and getting that right down to the bottom of the supply chain as well. So, it's great to see companies like that leading the way. What then people who procure the services of companies need to make sure they're doing is like making sure there's a level playing field when, requesting quotes and that sort of thing for services and not just going for the cheapest, but making sure now there's no child labour, there's no, modern slavery, there's no, obviously occupational health and safety issues as well with the vendors so that, those costs are, level, it's a level playing field for that rather than relying on people who, don't have, the ability to speak up when they're being asked to do things that are unsafe. So, I'm excited too, Susanna. I'm the optimist in the office. I think it'll take longer than 3 years given the complexity and the scale of these issues. But it's a very important step for the ILO to take, and hopefully we see the ramifications of this over the coming years and decades.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, what you said about procurement people needing to make sure that there aren't these things in the supply chains. This was my background in the past, and I know this area from research perspective, and it's fascinating field because still today, when it comes to child labor, when it comes to occupational safety and health, anything to do with supply chains, procurement people are not trained properly in most countries. And the incentives are still, unfortunately, we've been talking about this for years, but the incentives are still more in the realm of delivery lead time and the price. And as long as you're being rewarded as a buyer for those two things, that's what you will get. And then you also select some certain type of people end up in jobs like that. There was actually, I don't know if this is really the case, but I saw this study a couple of 2 or 3 years ago that they had studied psychopathology in supply chains, and they found that there's more psychopaths among supply chain professionals than in the prison population. But I can't vouch for that study. I can't remember how.
It'd be interesting
sampling
study.
bias, perhaps. Yeah, interesting. So other big news that happened this year was the WHO and the ILO published a joint guideline on workplace mental health, and that was September this year, which was also very exciting for those of us who work in this really niche field. Probably not very exciting for most of the world. Can you speak to any differences in how these two organisations approach psych health and safety?
Yeah, it's quite unprecedented that the two large UN organizations come together like this. So this just shows how important this topic is. What makes it a little bit complex is that, of course, the WHO its role is to work on health, and it's not really concerned about workplaces or psychological safety and health. It's not WHO's core mandate. So we're talking more about mental health, stigma reduction, and that sort of things. Whereas the ILO really is the key organization in driving this psychological health and safety at work. And the agendas are slightly different. So aligning the two has been they've done a fabulous amount of work, and it's really great that they came up with guidelines. Now, how to apply those guidelines in actual practice is a little bit challenging for companies, I think. So it's more of an umbrella of inspirational guideline than really a step-by-step guidance to companies. And I find that many companies still need a lot of guidance in, like what Flourish DX is doing is a systematic way of approaching this topic. So the guideline that ILO and WHO published is I think it's great, and I like the model that they used, Tony's model, the prevent and promote and support. So already that one gives a framework for organizations, somewhere to start with, and the prevention part really is ILO's core mandate. Then the WHO is more on the support side, and then the two are somewhere sort of in the middle of the promotion side. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, okay. And then the policy brief, I guess, is a bit more of a practical document than the guidelines in terms of where do you start and what do you do first and that sort of thing, yeah?
It is, and of course, ILO's mandate really is occupational safety and health. They have wealth of knowledge in this space. So there is, but there isn't really, legislation varies from country to country. There are different systems, different health systems, different legislations. So the ILO cannot just come in and create a guideline for that is valid for everybody. Nor can the WHO. So that has to be done at the country level. And the idea is to give an overview and some guidance on which direction the governments and companies can then take.
And so then is there an advocacy function then into government across the globe around sort of, okay, we've published these guidelines and now let's talk to different governments about how they can support or encourage or enforce or whatever language you want to use in that?
Incentivize. This is exactly what happened with the fundamental right at work. The OSH being fundamental right at work. This means that the governments have recognized that this is a fundamental right at work. And what it also means in practice is that the ILO has several conventions, and some countries have ratified them, some have not. For example, the United States has not ratified the OSH conventions. I think it's half of the ILO members who have ratified them. Ratification meaning that, legislation, something's being done about the legislation. They actually commit to changing the legislation. So, there's a long way to go. But at the same time, what core labor right means that they commit to making it a priority. And therefore, there's more of a likelihood that they will ratify it and they will do something in their legislation about it. Now, this is exactly what has happened with child labor and forced labor, for example. Most countries have ratified those conventions because they are core labor rights. So this is how it works, and it takes time. But again, governments have made the commitment, and now they have to deliver. And the ILO holds them accountable for the delivery.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, this is really interesting to just get a really, an insider's view on how all of this works, because it's all, a bit hidden from view, I guess. So, yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, Susanna, you're a very busy woman. You're also a member of the World Health Organization's Pan-European Working Group. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the WHO has a fantastic new initiative, 2022 to 2025, on how we can improve psychological health and safety. Not psychological health and safety, mental health in the workplace. But our working group really focuses on what can we do concretely in the workplace. So there are roughly 35 members from all over Europe, and some of them represent governments, some organizations, advocacy organizations, then people like myself who work more in the private sector. And the idea is to create recommendations on where European workplace mental health should be going by 20. And we're working on this, and there will be ongoing activities, and there already are ongoing activities. So this is a push to harmonize things in Europe, because of course Europe as a region is very diverse in this sense. You have the Northern Europe, places like Finland, where 90% of people are covered by occupational safety and health. There's excellent systems. The government is really putting money into it. And then there are places, for example, in Eastern Europe or some of the Southern European countries where this hasn't been the case. And there are different health models and different national systems. So harmonizing a little bit of, not harmonizing the models, but giving guidance on multiple areas, and sector tailored initiatives, getting inspired by getting inspired by countries where this has already taken place, like Australia, and so on and so forth. So it's very exciting, actually.
So tell us a bit about what's happening in Europe then with workplace mental health, and what's in the pipeline with taking inspiration from countries like Australia and Canada and so forth.
Yeah. The first area is probably a mapping of legislation, like how is the legislation in each country, and is it being implemented or not? Because many countries have great legislation, but it's actually not being applied. So that's the first step. And that falls a little bit into the ILO-ish realm. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I'll know more at the beginning of next year, but right now I'm speaking of what has been discussed. Then burnout is a really big concern, because it's one of the major issues in Europe and in all over the world, of course. But it's been recognized as one of the issues, and more of a systemic focus instead of focusing on individual health, mental health.
Yeah, that's music to our ears. Yeah,
I think the WHO has traditionally been working on individual mental health and national mental health systems to support individuals with mental ill health. And now here's an approach in the workplace which is more systematic and perhaps has a little bit of element of return on investment, and focus on cost savings, benefits, and incentivizing employers to work on this. Yeah. What makes it a little bit tricky is the fact that, as so many times in legislation, the health authorities are not the ones who are in charge of the economic incentives or workplaces. So the same thing plays out in the European Union, as it plays out between the WHO and ILO. There are different authorities deciding on different things, so those need to be put together, and there will be more of a stakeholder engagement. And I'm actually very excited because it's a great group. There's a real willingness to do things, and there's a real willingness to drive change, which is absolutely fantastic.
So do you think we'll have regulations applied across the European Union in relation to psychosocial risk management in the coming years?
There are already in initiatives at the European level, yes, of course, and there are things in place already at the European level. But it is a little bit tricky because the legislation is still country-based. So there's a big shift that needs to happen, and it's mostly mindset. There's a huge stigma around mental health in some parts of Europe, notably Eastern Europe. It's not talked of, but I don't see any country where mental health and well-being is a topic that's being discussed, openly discussed. I don't know about Australia, by the way.
It's pretty open these days.
More so, I think. And I think as we're getting younger generations of people into the workforce, there seems to be more willingness and openness to just talk about their mental health, where they will just say, look, I'm just not feeling great today, or, my mental health isn't what it normally is, or that sort of thing. So I think it is one of those sort of generational changes that's happening. And as we're seeing younger people come through, and they've been raised to be more aware of their mental health, and sort of being taught as they're coming through school that, that it's normal to have variance in how you're feeling, in your emotional states, and these are normal things to talk about, and you should be talking about them. And so then they're bringing that into the workforce as well, and hopefully helping some of the older generations to feel less stigma around that as well, and they're actually doing some education and promotion just through being themselves at work.
Yeah, Australia is quite inspiring, actually. I follow a lot of the Australian, organizations and what's out there, and it's nice to hear that it's actually being, it actually is at the organizational level already.
I'd still say it's still very much companies at the bleeding edge that are dealing with it more systemically. Yeah,
and this is more like, individuals will do things, and you can sort of see change at that individual level. But yeah, from looking at it from that, the culture of an organisation and having that systematic approach in place, no, we've still got a long way to go before that's the norm. But
on the right track.
We have aspirations.
Yeah, but it's definitely seeing a lot more, even just since the New South Wales regs have dropped, there's a lot more activity in the space with companies wanting to do something. And whether that's they're coming into it with the right mindset or not is another thing. But
doesn't matter.
It's
whatever gets it done.
Yeah, who gets it done?
As long as they do it well, like it might be,
yeah. And then I think the data, by the way, data is something that is being discussed quite heavily, and I'm really happy about that, because I like data and I like measured systems, and it's so good to see that it's already discussed at the European level. Like, we need to measure things properly in order to tailor our interventions. So again, you can't, what you don't measure doesn't get done. And there's so much hearsay, and there's so much feeling-based decision-making in the organizations. Whereas if you actually go in and you assess organizations properly, then you can tailor the interventions much better. And return on investment is really interesting. It's lucrative when you look at the numbers of at least 4 times the return on investment, and even more in certain cases. So I think it's really worth companies' while, but you need to provide more materials, you need to provide more case studies, more incentives for companies to move in this direction. So maybe we can get inspired by you guys in Australia.
We'll do our best.
No pressure.
Yeah. So, look, I am interested to hear a bit more about what you've been observing, because you do have, I guess, a fairly global remit in the work that you do. Have you seen any sort of positive trends, better practices emerging in the psych health and safety space in the companies that you work with lately?
I have seen a willingness to do more measurements. Yes, that is something, but it's the trick, and you probably know this, is that when you go to a company and when they don't measure it, they don't have a problem. And this can expose things that have been lingering. So there's this willingness to do measure things and expose them, but at the same time there's a lot of fear around that topic. And depending on whom you talk to, it's very different if you talk to health and safety people or if you talk to HR or if you talk to C-suite. But what I've seen, I see inspiring things in small ways. You know, like there was this burnout traffic light model that came out 2 weeks ago from Finland, where you can measure the level of burnout in your organization and among your workers. And they discovered that roughly 25% of Finns have been either in burnout or at the high risk of burnout. So there's this research and practices that have been having a ripple effect. I also have been very inspired by the Middle East, surprisingly, because that area, that part of the world doesn't have much legislation. And like we said, you know, there are these things in Qatar and many other countries in the region, but there seems to be a real willingness to change things in certain pockets there. And since there is no tradition or there's no long-term legislative, background, they're actually more open. It's a little bit like, in countries where you don't have a strong culinary tradition, people are more open to all kinds of vegan things and new things. They eat, there was this trend where people were going really into dried insects. That would not work in France or in Italy.
In Australia we'd eat anything, right? We'll have kangaroo. We'll eat the coat of arms, emu, kangaroo. We'll eat hot chips on bread with tomato sauce.
Nothing wrong with the chips, Rich.
Carbs on carbs. Yep. Love it. So exactly. We'll even eat Vegemite, which a lot of the world can't.
Vegemite is a delicacy. No, I get what you mean though. So if there's never this is the way we've always done this, then there's not that sort of knee jerk. No, we're not going to try this new scary thing, or this is the way we've always done it, and we survived and we were fine with doing it this way. So why should we change? That survivorship bias aspect of it isn't coming into it either. Yeah, that's interesting. We do have one client based in the Middle East, and it's actually been really lovely working with them. It's such a nice group of people to work with, and really, as you said, really open, really keen to learn, and really just genuinely wanting to do good by their employees. So shout out to them if they're listening.
Yeah, and there's a cultural tradition there also of taking care of people, which doesn't isn't perhaps part of the culture in other places. Which in Northern Europe, for example, there's more like you are independent, and Australia tends to be a little bit the same way. Everybody everybody takes care of themselves, whereas in the Middle East, there's more of a culture of taking care of others, which I find really inspirational. And also, there's an interest in building proper systems from the scratches, so that I find inspirational.
Are there any trends that are concerning you at the moment?
Well, I think that we all can share the trends where this whole workplace well-being has become such a trend, and there's been a gold rush all sorts of players. And if you look at the AA, the model of prevent, promote, and support, companies skip the prevention part and they go directly to promote. And then promotion can mean anything. It can be a health day, can be, website, it can be like mindfulness training for everybody, 30 minutes of something. And there's a whole range of these companies offering things that look good and blink and look fancy, but they don't necessarily do anything. And that is the one concern that I think many of us in this space share.
Yes, we certainly share that concern as well, and not only because we know that they're ineffective, but also because it it diverts resources from the things that actually are going to work. So it's not even that they're sort of a neutral presence. They do actually cause harm because they're diverting resources away from things that are actually going to be helpful.
Or just a miseducation, right? That saying this is the silver bullet that's going to cure all your ails, and companies that are ignorant of going, well, we've got a solution. We don't need to look at anything else.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that is the conversation that I keep on having. We don't really have an issue. Why should we open the Pandora's box? But again, there's whole range of advocacy that needs to happen for prevention. You need to lay the foundation for the house, and if you don't do that, then the rest is not going to be very sustainable. We all know the story of Three Little Pigs, so maybe we could learn a little bit from that one. Build a solid foundation and build a solid house.
Yeah. Or as Carlo would talk about it, build a cake.
Bake the cake first, then add the icing.
Then add the icing, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that the other trend which links to that solid house is that there has been a little bit of an instrumentalization of health and safety at work by certain people. So I'm seeing more, not litigation necessarily, but like actions that are being taken by employees. And in some cases, absolutely, there should be zero tolerance for certain things, like harassment and other ugly things, of course. But then there has been a little bit of an instrumentalization of this. And if you don't have proper systems in place, then it can become very messy very quickly. So for organizations as well, when you have clear rules, it's like having a tennis court or a rugby field or a Aussie football field. There are different rules for different fields, different sports. And when you have those, when you know which rules you're playing by, it creates safety for everybody. It creates safety for the organization. It creates safety for the employees. And safety is good for innovation. Safety is good for productivity. Safety is good in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Susanna, it's been a really fascinating conversation with you. You definitely have your fingers on the pulse in terms of what's happening on a global level, particularly over there in Europe. But one of the questions we like to ask all of the guests of the podcast is, if you were to look into the future, what would your hopes for the future of workplace mental health be from where we are now?
My hope is that this is a completely normal practice 5 years from now. That companies measure it, companies mitigate against risks, and then they take measures for people to empower people and help them feel better. And at the same time, I also have a hope that people will become independent and start taking more, empowering themselves as well. Because workplace well-being isn't just companies' responsibility. There's also the personal responsibility, and getting away from perhaps the I cannot do anything about this attitude, which is still pretty prevalent in many parts of the world. I think those two hand in hand, we can see a really big change. And being an optimist, I think that we are going to see this change, but I don't think that it's going to be perfect, Like Anthony Malmo said in your fantastic podcast episode, we talked about the wicked problem. It's never going to be perfect. And we shouldn't aim for perfection, but we should aim at improvements and actually steadily measuring the improvement and seeing how things change. So we can get to that 8-hour work week in terms of psychological safety and health.
Yeah, definitely. It's, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Yeah. And what we do now and what we do in 5 years' time will probably be two very different things, and we're learning as we're going at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
So last question for you today, Susanna. What words of advice do you have for listeners who are interested in working in psychological health and safety?
Educate yourself. Do research. And then look for sources that actually know what they're talking about. Look for help with people that actually know what they're talking about. Like yourselves.
Yeah, it's a bit easier said than done, I think, sometimes. As we were talking about before, those concerning trends, a lot of the time, they're led by people who do come across as very convincing and credible and do seem like they know what they're talking about. So it can be when you don't necessarily have that, the background in, training in psychology or whatever that might be, to be able to separate out what just looks shiny and pretty from what has good evidence sitting behind it. So it can be, I think, difficult to actually separate out who are the actual who's providing good information versus who's providing a performance that looks interesting.
Yeah, and what's concerning is, self-publishing authors these days.
Yeah.
So anyone can get a book published and get it as a top seller on Amazon, for example. I saw someone quite prominent in the field of psychological safety who was conflating psychological safety and psych health and safety.
Mm.
So in one breath, he was talking about, developing trust.
I know.
Trust, and ability to speak up without repercussions, and then trying to relay it back to legislation that's happening in Australia.
Yeah.
No. But he wrote a book about it, so he must be credible, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it is concerning.
Yeah.
But I do think that, again, being an optimist, I do think that this will change, because slowly we are over the COVID gold rush now, and there's been more retaliation in the US and in Europe as well. Not retaliation, but there's been more happening against just outright abuse of the terminology and approaches. And this, by the way, will be more of a focus in the European Union as well. So there is something more systematic and more evidence-based. So I think that this will happen, and slowly but surely there will be a couple of organizations that actually stand out because they have a solid foundation and they actually know what they're talking about.
Well, hopefully that day comes soon, Susanna. But Susanna, it's been wonderful talking to you. I'm very fortunate to have you in my network and get to chat with you whenever I like. So thank you for always being open to that, but really great to share that with our listeners. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing.
Thanks for having me. It's great to work with you.
Anytime. We'll have to make it an annual occurrence, I think. Mm-hmm. Psych health and safety featuring Susanna Harkonen. Great. Thanks, Susanna. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. So remember, we do video these when we have our conversations with our guests, and you can check out those videos on the Flourish TX YouTube page. You'll also find that we take some of the clips from these videos and we put them on our Flourish TX LinkedIn page. So follow along there. You'll see heaps of content from some amazing guests that we've had in the past. And while you're on LinkedIn, if you want to continue the conversation with Joelle, Susanna, or myself, then feel free to jump into our DMs and continue the conversation there. But thanks again, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.